Good afternoon, everybody. Letting you know what the new narrative is because the people who are kind of running the story, who have been running, I don't know, I'll be a little bit dramatic here and tell you the people who've been running the United States into the ground, but running it since the end of World War II. There's a narrative that needs to be out there. There's a narrative, there's a story. People like stories. Remember, we're reading the Odyssey in ninth grade English, and it's one of those things that, I'm not in necessarily. I'm not in a good neighborhood, right? I'm in the bad neighborhood, and you'd think that a 5,000 or a 3,000-year-old story, however old the Odyssey is, wouldn't really necessarily work, right? You always hear, oh, it's got to be relevant, and the people in the story have to look like the people who were reading it, and all this nonsense. It's all nonsense because people like stories, and they like good stories. But there has to be a story, there has to be a narrative for people to follow. And the powers that be have a narrative that they're crafting about the 2020 election. And they're pushing it very hard. It's typified in an exchange between George Stephanopolous and Rand Paul. And Rand Paul went on ABC and spoke with George Stephanopolous. I believe Amy Klobuchar was supposed to be the kind of like the Democrat, and Rand Paul was going to be the Republican, and George Stephanopolous was going to be the interviewer speaking to both of them. And then Klobuchar had technical problems, and it was just Stephanopolous and Rand Paul. And it's really an amazing exchange to watch because you have George Stephanopolous, a complete corporate swamp creature, media narrative shill for the establishment, talking to Rand Paul. And what he does is he tries to make Rand Paul admit that the 2020 election wasn't stolen, right? And so he starts the interview off by stating what he says is a fact. He says the 2020 election wasn't stolen. Do you agree with this? And that's an old rhetorical trick. State something that many of your readers or listeners in this case believe as a fact, and then watch the person try to deny facts. And because we're in an era where everybody is making up their own facts, particularly the people who are very quickly running these United States into these fractured United States, they have to have the story, right? And so the story is, and there are now millions of Americans who believe this. The people who watch George Stephanopoulos and take him as a serious person, take him as a journalist or someone who speaks thoughtfully on political affairs, right? There are people out there who actually think Stephanopoulos is legit. And he says, well, the fact election was stolen. Do you agree with this? And Rand Paul gives a very balanced answer saying, the idea of election fraud in election 2020 was never decided, and the investigations should be done. There should be some look into this. And Stephanopoulos pretty much goes off the rails. You see his face, and he gets angry. And I don't know if it's a show. I don't know if he's actually angry. You can't tell with these people because they're not really people. They're just actors. And so he's totally bent out of shape. Rand Paul starts talking about how the Democratic Secretary of State in Kentucky wouldn't purge illegal voters off of the rolls. And he gives an example of why he said what he said. And Stephanopoulos does, again, an old trick. He's like, I have to interrupt you. And then he brings up something that has no connection to what Rand Paul was talking about. There's also Dave Smith's latest podcast talks about this as well. I saw this at work and I was like, wow, I have to talk about this here in the studio. And I'll do super chats later. But it's Dave Smith caught it. I caught it. Lots of people catch this stuff. And Stephanopolous pretends to be the concerned journalist and say, wait. Can't you just say that the election wasn't stolen? Like he like in middle school, he has to have him grovel. He has to push Rand Paul around and make sure that Rand Paul bends the knee. Now, Rand Paul does a spectacular job at simply not saying what Stephanopolous wants him to say. And Rand Paul again goes into, well, the cases were all dismissed, because Stephanopolous does another rhetorical trick. It was the election, Trump and his allies brought the election to the courts, and 86 times they were swatted away. And Rand Paul starts to say, Stephanopolous doesn't want to hear it. Yeah, they were pushed aside because they were not given standing, which is a procedural way of saying we're not going to hear the case. And that's what happened at the Supreme Court. 7 out of the 9 justices said this doesn't have any standing. Only Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito said we should hear this. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute to show you how in the thrall, the swamp, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, has taken control of your country. The Supreme Court is there to resolve differences between the states. So when 7 of them, and it might have been more, bring a case to the Supreme Court and say, we think the right of vote of the citizen vote has been put at risk or denied in these cases, the Supreme Court, only 2 people, I will never look at those 2, Alito and Thomas, have more integrity than anyone else on the court. And Stephanopolous knows this. Rand Paul knows it. But Stephanopolous has to have Rand Paul stick with the narrative that the election wasn't stolen, that it was the cleanest election ever. And you've heard this is a clean election. 14-year-olds understand this. I'm not sure why some of you don't. The things that they need to convince you, to push you, they say it all the time. If it were just kind of common sense and part of us as humans with souls, they wouldn't have to always beat you over the head with it. So, cleanest election ever. Mostly peaceful protests. Flawless election. Cleanest election in years. No fraud. No evidence of fraud. Now, the American for whom I have contempt, the person who watches CNN for news. And you don't see the lady, I think it was in Georgia, pull out the box of ballots and put it on the table after everybody has left. Or them shutting down because of a broken water pipe in one of these counties, right? There were about 7 or 8 main counties, hardcore counties that were going to be the main locus points of fraud. Hennepin County in Minneapolis is one of them. The one in Georgia as well, in Atlanta. There are a few of them that were key, that had to be by the county, and because it will then swing the state. And the broken pipe, right? We have to stop counting and shut down for an hour or two until it gets fixed. Turns out there was no broken pipe. That wasn't in your news feed. I talked to a woman at work today, a counselor I respect and like, and she watches CNN. She likes it. She's not a bad person. She's a good counselor. I have her coming to speak to my students this week. I sought her out again to talk to her about things at work. She's a good person. But what happened was, she is someone who thinks that she's getting the news at CNN. And so she and millions of people like her are like, well, this is the cleanest election ever. And we had an insurrection at the Capitol. And this summer we had mostly peaceful protests. And now we have a new president. And isn't it glorious? And a black woman is the vice president. I mean, this is not a recipe for anything other than a split. An extended vacation, probably permanent vacation, from the quote-unquote other side. So there are these microcosm events that really show you what's going on. And the establishment narrative, they don't want you to just believe it. They want to make sure that you bend the knee and grovel before it, and that everybody else does too. And the people who don't are then rendered bad people. They're Nazis. They're conspiracy theorists. They're members of the far right. Right? They follow QAnon and they're just stupid and they send you emails and ruin Thanksgiving dinner. Well, I don't see how the cohesiveness, the quickly and rapidly disintegrating cohesiveness of the United States maintains. Simply because, right, it's why I put everything on BitChute as well as YouTube. Because the things I saw, Project Veritas, other independent news channels, had video of stuff that if it had gone the other way, if it were Trump people who were saying a broken pipe and then there was no broken pipe, and shutting down the vote counts, right? Was it 4 or 5 of these main counties, Hennepin County and the others, that all had to stop and take a rest? And then it took weeks to count. And then those states, I saw Pennsylvania up 250,000 votes for Trump at 9 p.m. on election day. He lost Pennsylvania, quote unquote lost. Another thing Rand Paul brought up. I believe Pennsylvania was one of these states where the Secretary of State changed the voter eligibility rules. Secretary of State can't just arbitrarily change voter registration and eligibility rules. The legislature has to do that. This is basic American rule, American politics. That's not some weird kind of thing. What else it's why a population schooled into oblivion in government schools is so easy to dupe, so easy to fool. The Secretary of State in no state can just arbitrarily change the law. That's why there's a legislature to do that. Do Americans know this? Probably not. The quote-unquote progressive, liberal, social justice warrior Democrat doesn't care. You know why? Because their team won. And you and I both know that if it had been Trump, specifically and especially Trump, but really any Republican had done the same thing, they would be screaming from the rooftops. Look at how the establishment for years, Russia collusion, Russia, all this Russia stuff. They still use that card. They use it because the mouth-breathing herd members believe it. Oh, Russia. Yeah, Russia with the GDP of Florida. Russia has about the international clout of Italy. So, when you want to see what, and I'm going to use this video in front of students, when you want to distill what is going on and how, long-term, how does this breakup of the United States, how did it happen? That's long-term. Short-term, you want to see like, all right, what's the narrative? What are they saying? How do they treat people who don't bow, grovel, and scrape before the narrative? This is a sitting senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. And Stephanopolous takes a shot at treating him like he's a punk. They didn't do that in the old days. They had more respect and probably more fear. But Stephanopolous doesn't have anything to fear. He's a member of the elite who run the United States. He's a member of the swamp in good standing. He doesn't have to follow the same rules. He's never going to go bankrupt. He's good. He's telling you the story that they're using for now. And when it all goes bad, because you can do that for a while, push people around, force them to not go out to eat, force them to wear a mask, force them to say up is down and down is up, and freedom is slavery. You can do that for a while, but not everyone's going to go for that. And, you know, um, it's why it's smart to avoid at all costs corporate media. I saw the Stephanopolous thing because it was linked on one of my private social media sites by a user there, somebody who's kind of in the same mindset as I am, and pointed to this clip, and it opened up a new tab to Twitter, and I saw this clip. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't pay attention to mainstream social media. I don't watch corporate media. Very easy and much better to live without it. But it's exceedingly valuable to see this stuff once in a while so you know what song is being sung and so that you know the narrative. I know the narrative. If I remember, I'm going to link to this thing in the show notes. I'm going to link to this in the description box below because it's just one of these markers that says, here's the way we're going to force you to think. And this is what we're going to say it. We're going to say it so often that it will become truth for millions of mouth-breathing herd members. No, there was no fraud in the election, and every legal attack, all 86 of them, to bring up a specific number, I think I forgot to mention that, bring up 86, right? People are going to remember that, 86 times. Trump went up against and tried to prove his case, and he failed. They were all set up and pushed aside because they don't have standing. It wasn't an evidentiary hearing. It was, you don't have standing. This isn't appropriate for this venue. Bounced. Right? Because Trump for all of his flaws and for all of the pro-war Yemeni massacre stuff and his ridiculous spending and that idiotic list he gave of people to pardon. Man, come on, man. Come on, man. Trump, what are you thinking with that? Come on, man. For all of those things, they didn't want him there. He wasn't one of them. And their reaction, the thing I always tell you to watch, the reaction gave it away. So now we're seeing the reaction to the 2020 election, and you're getting the story, and I'm showing you how to look for it. And that's why I teach school, right? That's why I haven't quit. So this is your lesson in how can you tell what's going on? How do you see what's up? And then the rest of it is up to you. You're an independent thinker. I'm not going to show you what to think. I just want to teach you how to think. All right, take care. I'll talk to you guys next time.